Because people don't realize that their very being is devoid of a self, they cling to their experience, they cling to the body and mind, and then this brings suffering. So that is why the Buddha teaches that the view of self is the source, the root of all suffering. Therefore, the Buddha teaches that one should abandon and give up all views of a substantial, solid, real self. And giving up the view of self is the passageway to permanent happiness, to freedom and permanent happiness. But if we just contemplate on the selfless nature of phenomena, that will lead to detachment, renunciation, and eventually to liberation. But to act within the world, to follow what we would call the bodhisattva path in the world, it's not enough just to give up the views of self, but one has to develop a sense of deep empathy with all other living beings. And so this is why the verse says, one abandons a useless view of a self, but relies on a great view of self, one that brings great benefit. Now, if you just take the verse, if you just read it superficially, it seems to be saying that one should adopt another view of self, and that would go contrary to the fundamental teachings of the Buddha. But if one understands the intent, it's not saying that one should replace the view of just an individual ego self with some kind of metaphysical view of a great universal self, but rather the intent is that one gives up all views of a substantially existent self and instead develops this sense of identification with all other living beings. And so to develop great compassion, one makes an effort to shift one's sense of identity. So instead of keeping the sense of identity focused within oneself, one tries to experience the subjectivity of others and make the subjectivity of others the basis for one's understanding of other beings and the basis for action within the world. So this involves what I would call a shift in the sense of identity. Initially, it's something that requires effort. And it's an effort which is developed in the practice of meditation, that one starts with the reflection that just as I experience my world from a particular focal point, a particular inner focal point, so I think that all other beings also experience their world from a particular focal point. And then I consider, why should I just keep myself centered within my own focal point? But let me spread my sense of identity so that I can, one doesn't have to be able to read the minds of others. It's not about developing supernormal powers. But inferentially, one considers that every other being experiences the world from their own inner sense of identity, experiences the world from an inner focal point. And when one is able to effect that shift in one's sense of identity, then one can experience or sense the being of all other persons, all other people, then more widely all other living beings as one's own identity. And doing this brings an upsurge of great compassion, great empathy, and it instigates a strong impulse to act to promote the well-being and happiness of others. This shift in the sense of identity, I think this is what Thich Nhat Hanh was speaking about in this poem, "Please call me by my true names." So what is my true name, or who am I? I am the child in Uganda whose body is reduced just to skin and bones. I'm also the arms merchant in Uganda, or how does it go?
The one selling arms.
The one who's selling arms to the government of Uganda, making a profit, so I could identify with them. I am the girl on the boat, it's left Vietnam, who jumps into the ocean because of the shame of being raped. I am also the pirate who has just raped that girl. So one's sense of identity is able to expand out until it can embrace all other living beings, whether animal, human, any type of living being. And expanding the sense of identity becomes greatly beneficial because it serves as the motivation for one to act to promote the benefit of others. Okay, this continues by describing, again, this is the action of the Bodhisattva in the world. Now, I should explain the way I understand this word Bodhisattva. Sometimes it gets used competitively, like there's the Arahat ideal, Bodhisattva ideal. One is following one or the other, they're considered to be mutually antagonistic. And then if one takes the Arhat ideal, it means that one is aiming to get one's immediate liberation from all of this terrible suffering of the world. If one follows the Bodhisattva ideal, it means one is going to remain for countless aeons in order to become a fully enlightened Buddha. I don't think the terms have to be understood in this sort of competitive, antagonistic relationship, but I would take the Bodhisattva ideal in a very broad sense as the ideal of one who aspires for enlightenment and liberation, but doing so in a way which involves self-sacrificial and dedicated efforts to promote the good of others and to rescue others from suffering. Okay, so here, describing the Bodhisattva, the text goes on to say, without a self, yet again taking up a view of self. Again, this is not the afflicted or defiled view of self, which becomes the basis for conceit, craving, and conflict. But this is the view, or it's more an attitude than a view, the attitude of identifying oneself with other beings and making the determination to work for their welfare. Okay, and so without a self, yet again taking up a view of self, without suffering, yet exposed to extreme suffering. Okay, normally we want to get free from suffering, and yet whether one is free from suffering or actually undergoing suffering is often a matter of one's inner attitude. And so if one has the determination to work for the good of others, then one is ready to undergo suffering on their behalf. And because one has the attitude, the determination that one is going to work for the good of others, even when one exposes oneself to suffering, one is not afflicted by that suffering.